Aloha to John. You read his description of who he was, but he really didn't tell you that much about himself. So I'll tell the rest of the story as opposed to the official story. He actually went to Korea roughly the same time we did, except he was had the language school, and so he was working there, reading or listening, I guess, to North Korean broadcasts and trying to understand what they're talking about. And that gave him sort of a great grounding in the Korean language. And from there, he decided he wanted to go to Korea University. And initially, they're a little skeptical about having these former military guys. But after he went and talked and chortled and about, I guess, properly, they accepted him. And he got his undergraduate degree from Korea University. And the rest is history and then he became a history major and he went to UH, was an East West Center grantee, and went on to that place in Seattle. Where's that school, Mike,
I don't
in
know.
Seattle? Anyway,
It's
some university up there. And from there, he taught at Idaho and enjoyed their hot springs, but they weren't good enough, so he went to LA. And I think that he and a couple of others really built LA into being the second best place to study Korea in the United States. I know that may be controversial. But at UCLA, he really produced a huge cadre of graduate students who have gone on and done many, many, many things. And after Mike Robinson, I'd say he's probably the best Korean historian we have. And I would say he's by far the most verbal in the Korean language. His ability in the Korean language is really great. And I think we can all hold him as a model. So having said that, he's going to now talk about going from Goryeo to Joseon. And I know some of you are saying, well, why should I care about going from Goryeo to Joseon? But he will enlighten you. So John, thanks for joining us.
Okay. I have a PPT prepared. I got to figure out how to get that up on the screen.
As long as it's on your computer, then you just click on the green box at the bottom of the screen that says share. Yeah. Click on the screen that you want to, the PowerPoint, and then there's a blue box that says share again, and you click on that.
Oh, I'm looking for that. I brought up my PPT on my screen.
So did you do the share, the green box at the bottom?
So first time, I don't see it a second time.
I mean, when you click on that, you should get several screens that are available, including the PowerPoint.
Okay.
If you don't see the share and you don't see audio and video and so on at the bottom of your screen, move your cursor down to it because it hides automatically.
Well, I've got the share here.
Start. Share, click, share.
It said recording in progress, Frank.
Yep. Okay, John.
We're back to Yahoo Mail, however.
Are you really?
Yeah.
That's weird. Okay.
Better. Good job.
Okay. I've got it. So this is the first of several PPTs. First of all, thanks for joining today. My wife warns me that I'm pretty boring as a speaker, so I will do my best to not be too boring. Anyway, let's talk about the transition from Goryeo to Joseon. As I think all of you are aware, this was the only change of dynasties in the last 1,000 plus years of Korean history. The result, it has drawn a lot of attention, particularly in the last 150 years or so. There have been various interpretations of the change from Goryeo to Joseon. There's the traditional Confucian notion of the change of the mandate of heaven from corrupt and incompetent last rulers of the Goryeo to the magnificently well-qualified and supremely moral Bisangye at to found the Joseon. Okay. Then there was the interpretation put forth by the historian apologist for Imperial Japan, which said the change of dynasties from Goryeo Joseon was simply a palace coup that was devoid of any real historical significance. It was all part of their depiction of Korea as a stagnant society. The North Koreans came along after 1945, and they announced that the change of dynasties from Goryeo Joseon was the reorganization of the centralized feudal system. We all go, centralized feudal system? What does that mean? Well, North Koreans and many other Asian Marxist historians talk about feudal society as a society where the means of production is land, and the relations of production are landowner, landlord, and tenant, peasant. And so that's why they can say feudal. In South Korea and others, they talk about revolutions. There was an intellectual revolution that occurred at the time of the founding of the Joseon dynasty, and that was came about as a result of the rise of Neo-Confucianism, which presented a new way of thinking about how to organize society. And then there's the social revolution, which is pretty common in South Korea, particularly by the Korean History Department at Seoul National University, where they say that the capital-based large landlord Buddhist aristocracy was ousted by a locally based class of medium and small landlords whose ideology was Neo-Confucianism. All of these interpretations are problematic in my view, and I will come back to why a little bit later, but now I'd like to move on to the next screen, please. Next slide. Okay. Oops, there's one missing there.
Did we miss a slide? There we go.
Problems of periodization, yes. Okay.
Okay.
Anyways, you could gather from the, I think from the comments I just made, the Goryeo to Joseon translation is related to questions of historical periodization. There have been a lot of, there's been a variety of different schemes of periodization that have been applied to Korea. The Japanese followed the positivist three-period periodization in which Korea was mired in the ancient period and never made the transition to medieval society, feudal society, unlike Japan, they say. Then there's the Stalinist 5 stages, which is orthodoxy in North Korea, and it's thinly veiled as the internal development theory in South Korea. Stalinist 5 stages, the idea that all societies will and must progress through 5 different stages of historical development, from primitive to ancient slave to medieval feudal to modern capitalist, and finally the workers' paradise. Then we have, starting in the 1990s, people who are working on Korea posited an epistemic break from pre-modern to modern. And those people are very much interested in the modern. Pre-modern is a starting point for them. And then there are other recent trends questioning the modern as a telos of history. Is history necessarily a story of inevitable historical progress? No. And the people are beginning to question that. But then there comes world history in the California school. World history has become really popular in the last 2 or 3 decades. And it's influential in many ways. It's being taught not only in universities, but also in high schools and even middle schools throughout the country. The world's history, as it is conceived and taught, is still largely Eurocentric, and it is teleological. And the common periodization schemes for world history, as it is now taught, emphasize the early modern, with, of course, France, England, and other places as the models. Now, on the other hand, the California School is basically a group of California-based economic historians. They critique the world history as still being very largely Eurocentric. But at the same time, they note that China and, well, basically China, because that's what they focus on the most. China was essentially the same as Western Europe in terms of its economic development, social evolution, up to the 18th century. And then from the early 19th century on, it changed a lot. And so Ming and Qing China are now depicted by those historians of China as early modern. And historians of India have jumped on the bandwagon and said early modern. The Japanese have always sort of held that they had an early modern period in the Tokugawa, which they call Kinzei. But they're definitely seen as early modern as well. So then the problem for me becomes, where do we place Korea within world history? Next. Okay, well, let's start from Goryeo to Joseon. Oops, we skipped one. Yeah, from Goryeo to Joseon. What I have found in looking at the social structure is that there was a great deal of continuity in the elites from Goryeo through the late Joseon. There was no social revolution at the time of the founding of the Joseon dynasty. But having said as much, I should note that the continuity in Korean elites is not unlike the continuity we see in European elites, European aristocracy, from medieval to early modern, in some cases even modern. So, but it's important to note there's no social revolution that happened in 1392. As far as the state, the systems of governance, the Goryeo system was organized along the Tang Song model of 3 departments and 6 boards, but it operated a bit differently than the way it did in China. Goryeo had what we could call a privy council, which monopolized policy formulation, policy review, and policy execution, all of which were separate functions under the 3 departments model from Song and Tang China. The Privy Council also exercised control over other major agencies through a system of appointment as supervisors of, say, for example, the Office of the Inspector General, the Halim Academy, and others. And the Goryeo local system of local administration was largely decentralized. Centrally appointed magistrates were posted in the prefectures and counties of Goryeo starting late in the 10th century, but never came to amount to even 1/4 of the total prefectures and counties. The others were administered through those prefectures or counties that had centrally appointed magistrates. Well, then what about in the Joseon system? The State Council, the Wijangbu, of which much is made in Joseon history, was actually much weaker than the Goryeo Privy Council. The Censorate, the Inspector General, and other agencies were independent of the State Council. There was no system of concurrent appointment to supervisory posts or anything like that. And the local administration came almost completely under the direct control of the center, of the central government. So Joseon became a highly centralized bureaucratic system, much more so than it had been before. And probably comparable to, say, what we might have found in 17th century France, for example. Okay, shall we go to the next? Thought and culture. Well, there were changes in the arts, there were changes in ceramics. The wonderful celadon of the Goryeo period, green celadon of the Goryeo period, faded away and was replaced by something called puncheongware, and then by pekja, or white ceramics. Architecture changed, moving more towards Confucian influence and away from the dominance of Buddhist type architecture. And we see the rise of true view painting and genre painting in the mid and late Joseon. We come to language. We know, of course, that in the mid 15th century, the Koreans created a phonetic script, Hunminjeongeum, which we now know as Hangul. Although the Hangul was sort of looked down upon by male elites at the beginning, by the mid to late Joseon, even male elites were making wide use of the phonetic script. We have poetry, for example, was written in mixed script, Sino-Korean mixed script, and we have other things that were written in mixed script. And we also can find quite a few examples of Yangban males, elite males, writing lengthy things in the phonetic script. Thought. This goes back to the question of whether or not we can talk about a Neo-Confucian revolution. My examination and that of others has shown that the early Joseon was a continuation of a mixture of intellectual styles that we can find in the Goryeo period, and with the addition, of course, of aspects of Neo-Confucianism. But Neo-Confucianism doesn't really achieve dominance in Joseon until the 16th century. So I would say there was no intellectual revolution. The economy. The early Joseon state really put a lot of restrictions on commerce, perhaps under the influence of the Zhou model of ancient China. But nonetheless, by the late 17th and 18th centuries, we see a great deal of growth in agricultural productivity and an increase in population. We see the rise of a market economy and a trend towards monetarization in the latter centuries of the Joseon dynasty. So if we take the longue durée perspective, that is the notion that significant change can only be seen over a long period of time, was popularized by Fernand Braudel, a French scholar, we can see that there was a substantial change between Goryeo and Joseon, even though it didn't happen right in 1392. Okay, next one, please. Okay. Now we are coming to the challenge of the California school. The California school presents two models. One emphasizes the early modern, and that's by far the most prominent approach. The other talks about something called an advanced organic society. Let's look first at the early modern. The conventional views, and this follows Kenneth Pomeranz, who's probably the leading advocate of early modern in China. So there's some of the features we see is population growth, increased commerce and overseas trade, rise of central bureaucratic states, upwardly mobile literate groups, new kinds of organized lay piety, the growing use of print, production of maps, enumeration of plant and animal species, and a cataloging of the diversity of human beings. Okay, next, please. So then, how does Joseon measure up to Kenneth Pomeranz early modern? The pros, well, we have a population increase. appears to have been between 200 to 300% between the 15th and the 18th centuries. The economy, it shows growth in the market economy, and there was triangle trade with China and Japan. Centralized bureaucratic state, as I've already said, I think 15th century Joseon is a good example of that kind of state. Print media. Well, there was a lot of stuff being printed by the state in the 15th century and 16th century, but certainly by the 18th century, we were finding commercial printing taking place in various locations, including Seoul and Cheonju and elsewhere. Mapping. Well, there's the 15th century Cognito world map. It presents a world to our eyes. It's very strange. Korea is pretty big. Japan's a little smaller. China is huge. India is smaller. And then way off in the corner, there's a Europe that's even smaller. It probably reflects what the Koreans had learned during the Mongolian Empire about the rest of the world. Catalog animal and plant species. Well, there was a tradition called Hyangyak, that is local medicine, where the practitioners of herbal medicine were cataloging these different kinds of plants in Korea that could be useful for medicine. The Sejong Shilok Chiriji, or the treatise on geography from the Sejong Shilok, also goes through and catalogs a lot of a lot of plant species, not so many of the animals. And we have things like the Chasan Obo that was put together by a scholar in exile in the late 18th century, which was a taxonomy of fish found on what was then known as Chasan, which today we know as Huksan Island. And it's come to my attention, thanks to an art history student at UCLA, that artists were beginning to show an interest in sort of cataloging, if I may, different plant species. And of course, there's a rise of vernacular. There's an increased use of the phonetic script in mid and late Joseon. Cons. Well, did Korea participate in a worldwide trading system? Well, sort of indirectly through China and Japan, but much less so by the late 18th century when Qing China and Tokugawa Japan established direct trade routes. So Korea was kind of cut out of most of that triangular trade. Upwardly mobile new literate groups? Who? Maybe we could talk about the Chumin or the middle people, but it's hard to describe them as upwardly mobile until the end of the 19th century. Organized lay piety. Well, in Goryeo, we had the Kyolsa, these Buddhist societies. But in the Joseon, it's difficult to find, I think, anything of that sort. Perhaps the mid to late 19th century Tonghak or Eastern Learning movement could be seen as that. The big problem is time lags. We have a centralized state in the 15th century, but we don't get a market economy until the late 17th or 18th century. We have Hangul, or phonetic script, in the mid 15th century, but widespread use really came about in the late 19th and early 20th century, like late 18th or early 19th century. We're talking about moments of modernity lost in time, something that has been discussed by a number of scholars. Or can we perhaps play with Kenneth Pomeran's idea of time scales? What does he mean by a time scale? The scale of time, the length of time, the duration of time? But he gives us sort of hint. He talks, for example, about how even though the steam engine was invented in the early 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, people were still relying on the horse in places like London, New York, and elsewhere for their primary means of transportation. But so I think, we can think of timescales as overlapping things. You get one aspect of early modernity arises at a certain time, and then another one comes along sometime later. They kind of overlap and build on each other. And perhaps again, the idea of the longue durée can be helpful here. If we think about this process of becoming early modern as also something that we should look at through the longue durée. I think we're ready to go to the next, Frank. Okay. There's another member of the California school, a scholar named Jack Goldstone, who's no longer in California. I think he's in Virginia or Maryland or someplace now, maybe in DC. Jack Goldstone critiques the early modern as teleological and Eurocentric. He said early modern features are common throughout history. You can find them in many different places and times, of thriving commercial economies, centralized bureaucratic regimes. He said, really, the more important thing is we have to understand that prior to the 19th century, everybody was reliant on organic sources of energy. Organic sources for almost everything. Wood to burn, wood to build houses with, all of those things. And he said that Holland, China, Japan were all advanced organic societies in the 17th and 18th century. But all of them fell behind England in the early 19th century. Why? Because of the availability of coal to the English. And then there's a long discussion, a long argument about why it was. Basically, large deposits of coal were close to major population centers in England in a way that was not the case in China, Japan, or certainly in the case of Holland. So what Goldstone says is that England was a historical aberration. What England became was not the result of some unique historical process, and inexorably took England to modernization, industrialization. The mainstream of history was the advanced organic society. And the features of the advanced organic society, they were agrarian, peasant, they were peasant societies, but they had urban cultures. They had centralized bureaucratic governments, they had substantial commercial activity, and they had some degree of differentiation between religion and state. The next one, Frank. So, can we look at Joseon as an example of Goldstone's concept of advanced organic society? Well, Joseon was primarily agrarian. There's no question about that. It was with a predominantly peasant population. Urbanization, not the same scale as China or Japan or some Western countries, but Seoul, Kaesong, Pyongyang, Jeongju, Jeonju, Andong, Ansong, not Andong, Ansong, all represent sort of emergent urban centers, particularly Seoul, Kaesong, Pyongyang, and to some extent Jeongju, really important in that regard. Joseon had that centralized bureaucratic government. Religion and state, there was separation between Buddhism and state in the early Joseon. It didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. And tensions, there were tensions that existed between the state and rural Confucians. So could we say that Joseon was in the mainstream of Jack Goldstone's world history? Possibly. Seems to be a better fit to me than the other, but please, let's go to the next and the last one. This is my dilemma. And I have to confess that ever since I was an undergraduate, I was trying to figure out ways to reconcile what I was learning about Korea and Korean history with what I had learned about history outside of Korea. I took the typical Western civilization courses when I was an undergraduate in Arizona. And so, you know, how do we deal with this? It seems to me that Goldstone's notion of the advanced organic society is perhaps the best fit for a society like Joseon. But his view has been largely ignored. Rather, the Eurocentric and teleological early modern version of the California school is dominant. But if Korea is not early modern, then is it outside the mainstream of world history once again, like the apologists for colonial Japan described Korea? So I've sort of gritted my teeth, and I've used early modern in my classroom and in some of my writings. I depict Goryeo as somewhat similar to decentralized medieval European societies, and Joseon in some ways like early modern Europe. But on the other hand, I continue to problematize the early modern, and I just really have a lot of difficulty with teleological views of history. My hope is somehow to show the limits of the early European or the early modern model and lead us to a less Eurocentric, less teleological way for research and teaching. Unfortunately, I'm getting too old. I've retired. It's been several years now, and I think maybe somebody in the upcoming generation will pick up the torch. But the truth is that at least in the West, well, there's a great deal, much more interest in Korean history than there ever was before. Almost all of the young people are opting to study modern and contemporary Korea. It's a nice fit for the more recent theoretical trends, and it's a really interesting place. We have people like Mike Robbins, who was a pioneer in the study of modern Korean history in the West. That almost all of us, including Ned, me, and others, have been mired in pre-modern ignorance. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate you listening to me.
Wow. Thanks, John. That was very interesting. Mark Peterson is here. A lot of the big people are here. Great. Anyway, questions and answers for John, please.
I had a question.
Okay, Richard. I think you're muted.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I had a question, John. We were talking about the modernization that was going on with Seoul, and then you said Cheongju. Was it Cheongju or Cheongju that you were talking about, or both?
I was not talking about Cheongju, and I wasn't talking about Cheongju in Chungcheong province. I was talking about the town of Cheongju in Pyongan province. It developed into quite a commercial center,
right?
Being based on the tributary route.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about whatever you label it. What was the impetus for the overthrow that caused the transition? Was it primarily to expand Confucianism? Was what was the gripe, that caused the changeover?
Well, from my perspective, it was a great deal of disorder and chaos in the late Goryeo, particularly when it came to the status system. The late Goryeo kings, in an attempt to bolster their power, became very generous with handing out official titles and prebends or land grants, if you will, and whatnot, to people who were not of the highest social status. And so when we see what happens in the early Joseon, one of the most prominent things is restoring that kind of social order. They put a lot of restrictions on merchants and a lot of restrictions on the local clerks or hyangni, for example. And so I think that was a very important factor there. There's kind of social tensions that threatened the status and the privileges of the central Yangban. And so the centrally based Yangban were willing to go along with the new dynasty in hopes that they would restore some semblance of order in the status system.
So there was a status of the old guard, if you will, who
Yes.
were, but there was also general chaos in commercial and other processes
Yes.
as well. So they
Now, there was,
took one, they took the more classist result to get the other.
yeah. And the merchants in Goryeo managed to prosper quite well during the Mongol period, during the period of Mongol control, with conducting their trade with the Mongols. And those people were seen as lower class. And so merchants were not welcome in the early Joseon. They applied really strong strictures against merchants in their activities. And then another problem was out in the countryside. The Mongol invasions really created a lot of chaos out in the countryside. They disrupted local society tremendously. And once peace was made with the Mongols, then what happened was that a lot of powerful families in the center took advantage of the chaos out in the countryside to expand their landholdings and even enslave parts of the peasant population. So there was a lot of disorder out in the countryside, and that had to be dealt with. And early Joseon seems to have done a really good job with that. They placed centrally appointed magistrates in every prefecture and county in the country, and they regularized the system of local administration so that there was a direct chain of command that would go down through the governor, then to the prefecture and county magistrates. So I think that the social aspects were really, really an important factor in the impetus for change.
Hey, John, thanks again. Being a Goryeo specialist, we like to talk about how the status of women actually declines in the transition from Goryeo to Joseon. Any comments on that?
Well, Martina Deutler has done a magnificent job of documenting how certain Neo-Confucian ideologues had a strong voice in trying to pass certain laws and regulations and whatnot, restricting women. But that didn't happen overnight. You know, one of the features of the Goryeo period, for example, was can't think of the English term now, Chanyo Junyoung Sangso. So equal inheritance rights for all of the children, male and female. That was the case in the Goryeo period, as near as we can tell. And we know that that persisted well into the 16th century. Yulgok, the famous Yulgok, for example, when he left behind his instructions, his will, if you will, he specified that daughters get the share of the thing. And also another feature of the Goryeo period, which helps to explain the higher status of women in Goryeo, was the Taerusawi, or the system where when a young couple got married, they went and resided with the woman's family. And Joseon, of course, we think it's all the man's family, which it was in the late Joseon, but a lot of the 15th and 16th century Joseon Yangban elites that I have studied were people who when they got married, they went and lived with their wives' families and stayed there in many cases. So I think the real sort of Confucianization, if you will, of Korean society didn't really take place on the wholesale level until sometime after the Imjin War. And, then there, yes.
Oh, John,
Yeah.
I don't, are you finished? I wanted to ask about the central Yangban families of the late Goryeo. Was there a
Mhm.
transition in new lineages coming in to assume power in early Joseon, or was there more continuity at the center between the two?
I think there was more continuity. The people at Seoul National University, they point to some examples like Changdojeon, for example, as was one of these locally based, medium and small landlord people who was a Neo-Confucian and who engineered much of what went on in the very early years of the New Joseon dynasty. But Changdojeon and his line didn't last. Changdojeon lost his life, and his descendants disappeared. Whereas people like the Andong Kim and the Kyungju Yi and these others, they remained very strong at the center. But it should be noted that one of the features of the Goryeo dynasty was that local aristocrats had almost guaranteed access to the government service examinations in the Goryeo period. And so throughout the Goryeo period, you can find new families coming into the center from that route. What happened in the late Goryeo period was that things were so chaotic and so much out of control that these people were coming in all sorts of ways and attaching themselves to powerful families and working their way up and into the office and whatnot in that fashion. So it was different.
John,
Thanks.
in connected to those last two questions,
Mhm.
I've been using in a one credit class about the traditional family. I've been using a great article that you wrote in the 90s that was published in Confucianism and the Family
Oh,
edited
yes.
textbook. I just wanted to ask you, do you still stand by the arguments you made there about precursors to the changes that occurred during the Chosun actually taking place during the Goryeo?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, uh, that's in some ways, but when I'm pushed in that direction, that's one of the hearts of my argument. About the long-term change that started in Goryeo and culminated in the mid-Joseon.
So it started in the Goryeo, but the old Goryeo practices continued into the Chosun.
Yes.
Okay.
John, my name is Carl Moskowitz. I have a question about the world history, and it may be centered on economic perspectives, but you've mentioned some points about slavery and the aristocracy. And so in a society such as Korea, from what we know from Shilla period on, about a very strong hereditary view to social status, is how does world history and economic analysis treat hereditary slavery and social systems? Do they do it at all? The closest thing in your summary presentation I could see was some changes in the economy and some, how do you say, peasant or general piety, such as the Kyosa in Goryeo. But do they think much about that at all, or do they just push it out of the way in favor of a more economically oriented or technical oriented analysis?
Well, they don't talk about, say, instances of hereditary slavery within Europe. Although I know just from some coursework I took when I was in graduate school that hereditary slavery persisted well into the medieval period in places like France. But slavery does play a really important role in the interpretations of people like Pomerantz, when he talks about what it is that enables England and subsequently the rest of the West to leap way ahead. He says, of course, we have coal and we have this beginnings of an industrial revolution, but slavery played a really important role in the development of the economies of the West. Slavery in sugar plantations in, say, the Caribbean, slavery in the American South, and other places. So, while they don't dwell on hereditary slavery within Europe, they certainly do see slavery as a very important part of the economic development of the modern West.
I have a quick question about world history, which I've learned a lot about from you.
Mhm.
But how do they analyze the growth of the civilizations in South America and Latin America before the Spanish conquest? How far did they get, in other words, in
They're
world
grappling with
economic
that.
history?
We've been learning a lot about. Of course, we've always known the Incas and the Mayans and the Aztecs had sophisticated societies to some degree, but we're learning more and more about just how sophisticated they were, and so I think that world history is still grappling with that, and I'm not sure that they've come up with anything other than saying that, well, it's kind of like the growth of the great civilizations in various other places of the world, which then died out, and so I haven't looked in that in that area very much. But that's about the best answer I can give you right now.
So we get to make the rules still because we haven't died out yet.
You got it.
Have you considered a Tangun-centric approach to world history?
Not very seriously. I can give you a little anecdote that might be amusing. I grew up in northern Arizona, in a sparsely populated area, mostly cattle ranches and miners. And then I went to the army and I went to Korea. And then after spending time in Korea, I learned about Tangun and all of this. And I said, oh, that's an interesting myth. And I saw some statues to Tangun in a few places here and there. But if you had told me in, say, 1972 or even 1980 that there would be a statue of Tangun in my hometown, I would say, you're crazy. You're absolutely wacko. But it turns out that a Korean group called the Tanzan people, they decided that Sedona, which is right over the mountain from where I grew up, Sedona was a great place to get ki, to get the vital energy from the earth. Right. And so they opened up a little training center there, and they had an office for this training center in what you might call downtown Sedona. And one of my friends from Korea, a professor at Korea University, he had come to LA several times. And one day he shows up in LA and he says, I want to go to your hometown. I said, why would you want to go to my hometown? He says, well, I've read some interesting stuff about this Tanzan Ho group, and I'd like to go check it out. So we hopped into my truck and we drove from LA over and spent the night with my mom in Prescott. And the next day we got on the road and went over the mountain and down into Sedona, which is, those of you who've been there, you know, but those of you who may not have been there, it's a fantastically beautiful place. And I was seeing it anew through my friend's eyes. Wow, I'd never really appreciated how great Sedona was. Anyway, we located this office on the main drag there in Sedona. And they said, oh, geez, you're historians. And my friend was a historian of ancient Korea. And so they were kind of excited. So they called over to the training center and said, we've got some VIPs here. They're going to come and visit you. And so they arranged for us to go over there at about 9 o'clock the next morning. And so we went and spent the night in a motel. And then we drove over there. And I'm driving past ranch land that the family we used to know owned, and going back towards my hometown in Prescott. And then we turn off on a side road and we go up, I don't know, several miles, and we come to this training center. And we pull in there, and right before we got there, apparently a big bus full of Korean Americans from Los Angeles had come to check out this place. And so we said, okay. And the guy took us aside, the leader there and director or whatever he was. He took us in and he explained to us a little bit about his facility and what they do there and whatnot, and how, very reasonable presentation. And then he said, but now I want to show you something. He took us over this hill in the back of the center there, and there in the middle was this huge statue of Tan. I just went, oh my God. Kuchewagos everywhere, right? And I guess he saw the look on my face and he said, well, we start off with Tangu because he's ours. But, we plan to put in statues of the Buddha and Confucius and Jesus and Muhammad and all of the great spiritual leaders of the world. I said, okay, thank you for the explanation. Anyway, I went back to LA and said, wow, that was quite an experience. I understand that the local yokels over there decided that these people who had this statue of this god that they were worshiping up there on the mountain just didn't fit with the local society, and so they put a lot of pressure on the Tanzan people, and they eventually, I guess, sold out and moved off someplace else.
But they're kind of influential, aren't they, John? That research group in Harvard that was disbanded because they objected to the research on ancient Korea that was being done.
Yeah.
I wish
we've had
Mark
problems with
Peterson
that.
was here because he has some real strong opinions on that.
Yeah.
So I have a question, if I might. I'm from Arizona. I grew up in Arizona, so I appreciate your remembrance of Arizona and the Korean connection. But I as an amateur in this field, I mean, I always thought of the transition from Goryeo to the Joseon dynasty as moving closer to China. And you talk about the Confucianization. I mean, is that in your mind the same as becoming more, is it sinicized or sinicized? But anyway, closer to China, either in terms of ideology and culture. Some of your kind of things on the slide seem to suggest that. So there's kind of that, and also, what is the impact between the influence of China? I'm kind of giving you a lot of questions now. You talked about how Japan looks at it, and so on. I realize the officials of China now may have their own view of, and maybe it's not that different of where Korea fits. But just, how important was China and Chinese dynastic change and influence on the transition? And I'm going to tell you a story, the last two before, and that's actually a Chinese diplomat said this to me once when he was trying to explain to me why the DPRK, the Kim dynasty in North Korea may last a long time. And he was totally serious about this. He said, in China, we change dynasties, every couple of centuries or so. And in Korea, they only did it once every 500 or 1,000 years. So wait.
Yeah. China. Wow. Well, to the Koreans, China was an advanced country. was a place from which they could learn, and they could adapt a lot of things. But we find that in the Joseon period, this becomes a big issue. What is more appropriate, Korean tradition or Chinese teaching? But we can go back into the Goryeo period, and we can find statements such as that supposedly made by Wangan, the founder of the Joseon dynasty. He said, "We learned a lot from China. Chinese institutions are great, but our land and our people are different from China. We should not slavishly try to be like the Chinese." Find that statement. You can find other statements throughout the Goryeo and into the Joseon period, where people are voicing a certain sort of nativist sentiment. Chinese stuff is good, but we have our own ways of doing things, and we need to preserve those. And so, people talk about Korea as a society that was perhaps even more Confucian than China was. I always thought that was kind of a problematic assertion. But as Martina Deutler, I think, shows nicely in her book, a lot of Korean customs and traditions and ways of doing things persisted despite the enthusiasm among certain groups of Confucianists for implementing Confucian-style patriarchal system in Joseon and whatnot. So, did China have a lot of influence on Korea? Yes, but was Joseon dynasty Korea more like China than Goryeo? I'm not so sure about that. For example, Joseon dynasty intellectuals were very critical of the kind of Confucianism that was being practiced in Ming China, for example. And then after the Manchus took over, the people of Joseon started thinking of themselves as being sort of the last bastion of civilization. The barbarians are inside the gate in Beijing, and so now we are the ones who will carry on Confucian civilization. And so they saw themselves as being part of a Confucian civilization, but not necessarily as being Chinese. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the way I tend to look at it. Where in Arizona are you from?
I grew up in the Phoenix area, but I actually went to school in Prescott for a while, so I know
Oh,
of
did you? Yeah, all those cowboys, right? Yeah, all those wannabe cowboys. Yeah, I was. Do you know where Skull Valley is? Yeah, that's my hometown.
Hey,
That's,
John,
yeah.
we in the West seem to be following Mike Robinson's lead in wanting to study contemporary Korea. What's happening in the history departments in South Korea right now? Is Chosun eliciting a lot of interest, or is it also kind of caught up with Hallyu?
The time when I was doing my dissertation, Joseon was hot stuff, right? But now in South Korea, you find a lot of people studying ancient Korean history. The sort of reference to what Frank was talking about a little bit earlier. But more than ancient history, a lot of interest in modern and contemporary Korea, and not so much interest in Goryeo and Joseon. Sad.
That makes it easier for you and me because we can talk about things and nobody can correct us.
Yeah,
They
nobody
don't
knows.
Yeah.
Except the older Koreans, right? Yeah.
Well, John, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking us back into the 15th, 14th centuries, and we appreciate you putting together all that information. And unless there's any other questions, I'll send it back to Frank.
Okay, yeah. As Ned just said, thanks a lot, John. I found that really enlightening. It was very interesting. Very interesting
Yeah.
talk.
Frank,
But as you can tell, these are questions of which I've been grappling for a long time, and I don't have any easy answers. But that's where I'm at this stage.
Okay, so thanks for joining us. It's about a quarter after. Do we want to? Some time ago, we used to break into small groups. Do you want to break into small groups or not?
Frank,
Yes.
well, I can ask John directly. What's your email so that my questions that come up tonight while I'm trying to sleep, I can get to you tomorrow.
So well, it's what it always has been, Mike. It's Duncan at Humnet, HUMNET.UCLA.edu.
Net
Yeah.
at
And what's
UC,
your current email address, Mike?
um, ROBIME, Robime at
Mhm.
IU.edu.
Oh, at IU. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think I've still got that one, but I just didn't know whether it worked or not.
yeah.
You're looking good, guy.
Well, you are too.
Yeah.
Looking
Before I
retirement.
sign off, I'd just like to say that we have here in this group two people who were just wonderful Sunday to me, Ned Schultz and Mike Robinson. I owe both of those gentlemen a great debt in helping me get up and going in graduate school and then in my professorship. And I just want to say thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. So no small groups today?
I've got to get going.
Okay. Any dissenting opinion? No. So let me stop the recording.